If you've been following this channel for a while, you're likely aware that I'm a pretty big Beatles guy. I'm always thinking about the Beatles during the summer, for the very practical reason that I play in a band that every summer performs all 215 or so Beatles songs over a week-long Beatles festival. So it's in that frame of mind that I was thinking, I'm probably not the only video game music guy that really likes the Beatles. And if there's one thing Beatles fans love more than anything, it's talking about the Beatles. So, I have two guests joining me today for a discussion on this topic, the Beatles and video game music. Now, I know what you're thinking.
Joey, what does a boomer band like the Beatles have to do with video game music?
Well, that's what we intend to answer in this very video. My first guest is 8-Bit Music Theory, a game music analysis YouTuber whose channel is absolutely invaluable for learning theory through classic game music. Also joining me is Garrett Williamson, an extremely talented and very prolific game music composer, whose work I first encountered in the Super Smash Bros. Melee documentary, Metagame. Now, if you're following this channel, you're likely already familiar with one or both of them, but in case you're not, do yourself a favor and give them both a follow. I assure you, you will not regret it. Admittedly, this topic is a little bit niche, but I think the points we hit upon here are pretty broadly applicable to anybody who's interested in video game music, or just music and songwriting in general. If nothing else, I had a great time talking with these guys, and I hope the conversation is as fun to listen to as it was to have. Oh, and in case you're new here, my name's Joey, and on this channel I primarily do covers and analysis of video game music. So if you're into that sort of thing, I would be honored to have your subscription. So, thanks for listening. Let's jump in. I guess the first thing I kind of want to get to is, for everybody here, we're all obviously, really influenced by video game music and the Beatles. So I'm curious, as musicians, along your kind of musical journey, where do video game music and the Beatles fit into that?
I think for me, the Beatles were a big part of, actually both of them. I would say video game music and the Beatles were both kind of two of the biggest musical influences on my early life, like childhood. Mm-hmm. And, my dad had a big book of every Beatles song they ever recorded.
Nice,
and the chords and the lead sheets for them, basically.
Yeah, I think I have that book.
yeah, right. Yeah. So he would sit and just play Beatles songs for fun. And then as a little kid, I would see that and be like, oh, I want to do that. That sounds fun. Mm-hmm. So I taught myself how to play guitar just to play through Beatles songs from this book. And then video game music was kind of my introduction to, I think, instrumental music or just non-vocal music.
Sure.
Which is, I think, a different world. I think you have to separate vocal and non-vocal music.
For sure, yeah.
And so I didn't really see a distinction between the two when I was a kid, between video game music and real music or whatever, which I think is probably has something to do with my current career.
yeah.
But then I will say the Beatles also was my big actually I have it right here. I was looking through it in preparation. But this big book, Songwriting Secrets of the Beatles.
Ooh, I never heard of that book.
It's like a hefty tome.
Whoa.
And it's all about yeah, right. It's about music theory, and it's just the way this guy, Dominic Pedler is the author. It's breaking down music theory from very simple principles to more complicated songwriting techniques, just using Beatles songs as examples.
Sure.
And the way he thinks about theory is was a huge influence on how I operate my channel and everything, because it's very different than the kind of academic way of learning it.
Yeah.
So definitely both big influences on my life and career.
Interesting. Have you, just out of curiosity, have you seen the on the internet? I know there's this one guy, Alan Pollock, I think. He did a bunch of analysis of the Beatles songs.
I might have read through every single one of his.
yeah. I'm the same way. All right, so how about you, Garrett?
Yeah.
What was your kind of journey there?
Similar to Ben. I grew up in a musical family, so my dad was super into the Beatles. He was made Beatles stuff since as long as I can remember. So I'm from a young age I was obsessing and listening to Come Together 5 times over. But then yeah, I also grew up with video games and fell in love with video games, and then when I figured out, wait, you can do video game music for a living, it's like, well, I want to do that. That's like I fell in love with video game music. And I don't think I was kind of in the same boat. I don't think I really made a connection until a little bit later that a lot of this music obviously had to be inspired and influenced by something. And when one thing that I constantly want to know about is like, okay, I love this artist, what are their influences? What inspired them? And so it was there was sort of that connection, especially like once I just started noticing just like how melodically brilliant and all that kind of jazz with the Beatles, and how I could also see that in a lot of video game music. That was definitely a major connection for me. But yeah, then with my own personal journey, I'd say it's just kind of been, I'm inspired by, say Koji Kondo or Jun Sonoi, if I probably butchered his name there, but
that's all good.
Yeah, just as much as I'm influenced by the Beatles or Led Zeppelin or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. So, yeah.
I think it's kind of similar for me. Obviously my parents listened to classic rock radio a lot, so I would just hear that kind of stuff and kind of get into it. But I think the thing that really kickstarted the Beatles thing for me, especially, was right around like I guess freshman year of high school for me, when they released like the 2009 Beatles remastered CD collection, right? So when I heard that was coming out, like, obviously in my head I was like, oh, this is really cool. Like I could really get into this, and I just decided, okay, let's listen to everything. I got it all. And so it really like became an obsession from that point, because like going chronological order, seeing like the development of everything over like such a long period of time, is like, oh my god, this is unbelievable. But it's kind of funny. I can recall when I was in high school, like I would be too embarrassed to put video game music on my iPod. Like I didn't want it to like mingle. Like it didn't seem right to me. And it wasn't really until like I started learning about music and learning to play music and taking it more seriously that I realized, like, like at the end of the day, all of these composers are playing with the same tools. Like they're working with the same kind of framework. And once you kind of like, once you realize that, it kind of democratizes everything a little bit, and you don't separate your different kind of sources in a significant way. Though I do agree the instrumental thing is important, and I think that I credit video game music a lot with kind of like priming me to be able to get into jazz later on, which was essential for like my musical development in college and everything. So but
honestly, same.
Yeah.
There's a quote from Paul McCartney where he was talking about growing up writing music and thinking like, we're just writing, silly songs. Real music, the serious classical music, that's like a whole different thing. That's very deep. I could never get into that. And then I don't know how old he was when this happened, but apparently he listened to some Mozart and kind of was like, oh, this is just the same thing we're doing. It's all the same stuff. I think like the way you go about writing and experiencing vocal music and instrumental music is different, but I love like such an innovative band as the Beatles. Of course, they're going to take things that you wouldn't expect to take from other places, especially at the time, and like incorporate that into their music. But that's an interesting. That's funny that you bring up the remastered album collection, because that for me too. I forgot about that, but that was the moment I became a bigger Beatles nerd than my dad. Was when I got all these records.
Exact same thing for me. Like I was like bringing up songs that he had never heard of in his life. It's probably songs he still has never heard of that like I'm obsessed with. The idea that I had for this video was the Beatles and video game music. So I want to kind of get into that topic a little bit more broadly with you guys. And I'm just going to ask this question. So let's say if somebody came up to you and asked, what do the Beatles have to do with video game music? And you weren't allowed to say nothing. What would you come up with as a answer that kind of like bridges the gap between those two things?
Well, for me, I think, so the Beatles did a lot to change the music industry
Mhm.
and music in general. But one thing in particular that I think they did that was huge is they kind of cultivated a harmonic language and a melodic language, but a musical language that subsequent bands all drew from. Like for the music, the style of rock music was basically partially invented by them.
Mhm.
And there's some really interesting parallels between early video game music and that kind of language. Like if you think about the Beatles music as a whole, if you tried to like break it up into broad influences, there's a little of Tin Pan Alley, there's a little of folky singer-songwriter-y,
Mhm.
you know, 3-chord stuff, and then there's this kind of rock and roll thing,
Mhm.
and then there's, you know, Indian influences and classical influences, other stuff. But I feel like those are kind of the big broad strokes,
Mhm.
and those are the same kind of big broad strokes that I would say influenced a lot of early video game composers in Japan, like the
Sure.
Uematsus and Koji Kondos. Maybe in a different ratio, maybe a little less Tin Pan Alley or something, a little
Mhm.
less country and a little more just straight up jazz.
Mhm.
But that kind of like, if you think about like the Zelda theme or the Pokemon theme, that kind of like G to F to G, like a 1 to flat 7 to 1,
Yeah.
is like that move, that kind of thing was I wouldn't say it was invented by the Beatles, but it was definitely explored to its some of its fullest potential by the Beatles,
Yeah.
or brought into the public musical consciousness.
Mhm.
And that's like a huge video game music staple, you know,
Oh, yeah.
and all of that
Yeah,
kind
absolutely.
of heroic video game music stuff.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
Yeah.
that's one example of many that I think you could draw a clear connection between the
Mhm.
two.
Yeah. Gosh, I think a big thing would be chromaticism for me. I feel like like the Beatles kind of a lot of my favorite stuff that they did was very very brilliant chromatic voice leading, and I feel like that is very very well used across some of the strongest video game pieces as well, especially in the earlier days. But I think I let Ben go first, and he stole all my lines. No, I'm kidding. But no, I think what I would say is probably the chromaticism. I think stuff like Blackbird is so the voice leading and chromaticism of that piece is so smooth and so brilliant. And I think there's a lot of songs from early video game days that kind of echo that in their own great way.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I like you mentioned, like there's a good chance that these composers were influenced by the Beatles just because of the time period that they were coming up in, right? Like the video games really took off in the 80s, and any composer that was just getting started in that time, a lot of them were like young guys, either like just right out of college or just kind of like looking for a gig, and like Uematsu and Koji Kondo especially, right? Like, and that would have put them right at the age where they were growing up while the Beatles were still together, while they were still like a worldwide phenomenon, like actually happening. And you see it in interviews all the time. Like if you look at interviews with Uematsu or Koji Kondo, they'll always bring up the Beatles as like some kind of like formative thing for them. I even read an interview with like Miyamoto, who's not even like a composer or musician. I mean, he's a musician, but like he was talking about like, oh yeah, I got into music because of the Beatles, and my brother showed me the Beatles, right? That's just like a common story among like so many people, especially from that time. So it's definitely in the air, even if you can't point to like super specific things that are like, oh, that came from that song. There's definitely like some like total thing happening in the industry that I feel like you can definitely draw some parallels.
Yep.
So is there anything like you mentioned a couple, but I'm curious if you have any other like thoughts. Are there any like composers or things in particular that remind you of the Beatles in particular? You think like, yeah, this song makes me think like Beatles influence is creeping up in here.
Kind of what like I think more so even than any specific harmonic patterns. Obviously, the kind of like modal borrowing thing I mentioned is a big one, but the ethos of the melody being like the top most important thing, and then everything else about the arrangement supporting the melody is definitely not, melody's always been important. But if you look at other genres of music, especially like from the 60s onward, jazz and the classical world, melody just isn't as important there. And early video game music, it's the same thing. Everything is supporting the melody. Now, like when there was such huge limitations on like what you could do musically, having only 3 pitches at a time max.
Yep.
You kind of have to make the piece of music make sense. You have to have like a really strong melody and then support it any way you can. So I don't know if that's a direct like because of the Beatles or circumstantial, but that's definitely a parallel I see.
Yeah, kind of along those lines, I was thinking like kind of recently, not only is it like the focus on the melody, but I almost feel like in a lot of ways the structure of video game music is not that different from the structure of pop music from that era, because you basically have like 1 or 2 repeating sections in a video game song, especially like old video game music. You might have an A section, a B section, and it loops indefinitely. And if you look at like a pop song, like you might have an intro, you might have like an ending, or you might not have an ending, you might have a fade out, right? But at the end of the day, like you're still talking about, like an A, B, A type of structure or something like that, right?
Right.
And
totally.
So they're similar in that sense. Like I feel like video game music has a little bit more in common in that way with popular music than it does, for example, like film music or something, because it has a structure of repeating sections as opposed to like through composed kind of like that kind of style. So that's always been a parallel I've kind of drawn, and it makes it easy when you're trying to do like covers of video game music, for example, because I can literally just like take a song from Mother 3 and be like, okay, I'll just play the tune twice with an intro, and there you go, I'm done. Right. Like I got an arrangement that would feel perfectly at home on a Beatles record.
Yep.
Totally.
I feel like a big thing, because I just pretty much refreshing my brain again this morning. I was literally listening to stuff last night and that documentary, which was just great timing. But no, even just listening to like Beatles again this morning, it's just the one thing that I really do pick up there that I hear a lot in a lot of strong video game pieces. And again, I know Ben even said like the NES and Game Boy and stuff, they literally only had like three notes you could play at a time, right? So it was very important to have a strong melody. But that being said, the Beatles, listening to that stuff, really, really strong melodies throughout pretty much anything they ever wrote. And I think what stands out to me is if you listen to a lot of what else was going on around the 60s or before, like say the 50s or something, it's not that there weren't strong melodies theoretically, but it's like it was way less. It honestly it was very very repetitive, very straight, rock and roll, just constantly, 1 for the money, 2 for the show, and it's like kind of just going through the same few notes, and it's like there's nothing theoretically wrong with that, but the Beatles did, I think, maybe along with say the Beach Boys or something, really changed the playing field, where it's like, no, let's actually write verses and choruses with moving melodies that actually go places, and a lot of my favorite video game pieces do the same thing. This thing, We Could Go's basic as ever. The Super Mario Bros. Theme is all over the place. It's incredibly memorable, but it's, that melody does not sit in one spot.
No, you're right. Yeah.
But that's what I love about it, and I think I suppose that's a pretty strong connection I can make. I've been staying pretty safe within the Mario and Zelda realm. Related to the Beatles at the moment. But I could also Final Fantasy is another one that I definitely could hear a lot of connections with.
For sure. And it's funny you mentioned the Super Mario Bros. Thing because of that famous story Koji Kondo told that one time where he met Paul McCartney backstage. I think this story is so funny to me because I just love the idea that like Shigeru Miyamoto had like pull that he could get them backstage at a Paul McCartney concert.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, like Nintendo must have been like so huge in a way that like, and they are and like so huge, but like it just seems like wild to me. Like when you look at those two worlds together, it's like, oh yeah, Miyamoto totally had the clout to just go backstage at a Paul McCartney concert. But yeah, he introduces Koji Kondo to Paul McCartney as the composer of Mario, and Paul just starts singing the Super Mario Bros. Theme. So he knew it, because Paul's a guy that knows something about good melodies.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting little connection there.
Yeah.
There's definitely like I have a couple of thoughts in my head of songs that remind me of the Beatles, but I think the thing that I think is valuable about this exercise is that in terms of learning music, I found that one of like the best things is when you recognize similar patterns across different styles, different genres, and it just reinforces your knowledge of like a chord progression, for example. Like if you hear it in two different places, and it's like, okay, now I really know what this is.
Totally.
I totally understand this now. So I can think of like just a few examples of some stuff. So let's take just the classic, 4 minor to 1, That's like one of my favorite cadences. And I think that the first place I heard it, or at least the first place I remember like being conscious of thinking like, wow, that's a really pretty sound, was Melodies of Life, the Final Fantasy IX song, where it does that like right, like super pretty, and I just remember thinking, wow, what's up with that? But then later on I thought, that's actually something the Beatles do all the time. Like you got like In My Life, the In My Life I Love You More, right? I was thinking like another song from Final Fantasy VIII. There's a song called Breezy, which is just this kind of like solo guitar like little thing. It's like a fingerpick song. There's one part that's just like this right, and those voicings right there are the exact same voicings that Paul plays in Mother Nature's Son on the White Album, where he just does this like, and it even has like the D pedal in there too. Like it's the same exact thing.
Funny.
But like, and I'm not saying like, yeah, these are definitely inspired by each other, but they are the same, And when you make that connection, it's like, wow, I really get this now. Like this actually makes some sense to me. And I think that's like one of the coolest things you can do when you're kind of exploring music on a broader level, and you're listening to so many different influences and recognizing, wow, that these guys are all, like I said, they're all kind of playing with the same stuff. They're all playing with the same tools and can come up with that.
Yeah, I feel like the Beatles made a bunch of tools like that available for a lot of people. Because
for sure,
that's very of the kind of 20s Tin Pan Alley musical style of writing, that minor 4/1 thing.
Yeah.
And the Beatles like covered a bunch of those songs when they're starting out. If you think of like Till There Was You.
Oh yeah.
That's like minor 4 is a big part of that. And
I love that song so much.
Obviously in their own stuff, I'll Follow the Sun and all the other ones that you mentioned. Kind of take that tool and put it in a different context, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can use this in Melodies of Life and it won't sound like a 20s musical,
Yeah, right.
It's
exactly.
modernized in a way.
Yeah. It's like that stupid Among Us meme. You see Among Us everywhere. Like I see the Beatles everywhere. Things like there was I recently did a cover of this Mother 3 song, Mind of a Thief, and the intro to that song is like this kind of like drum intro that goes like boom tap boom tap tap boom, tap.
Oh, no way.
I was like, oh, it's what you're doing on Beatles for Sale. It's the same thing.
Yep.
Well, that's hilarious.
And then like later in the song, it does this move where it's like A minor. It's like A minor, then like A minor / G, A minor / F sharp. I'm like, oh, that's While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Got you right. But it's just like it's funny when you recognize that, because again, it's just like, wow, now I really feel like I have some knowledge here. I actually kind of get it, you know.
Right. Yeah. I do think I think that the Beatles just gave so many people permission to write certain, because they took so much from so many other places. They just kind of became this like melting pot of just music across the globe. And so it's like so much music, I think, takes so much from them just based on the fact that they took so much from like everything, you know, like they Beatlemania started off as, you know, I guess a little bit more rock and roll and all that kind of stuff, but you know, as time went on and they got more exposed to other kinds of music across the globe, you know, the way they wrote changed, and so but they were so diverse in such a beautiful way where, you know, they pretty much started hard rock with Helter Skelter. But then they could do a beautiful string quartet piece like Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and like it's such a huge. I noticed that, like, you know, with Uematsu's stuff on across Final Fantasy, where he has such a there's so many different styles across, you know, the 9 games that he fully composed, and it's all so well done.
What I always say is that the Beatles used their powers for good when they got insanely popular doing what they were doing, and then once they got to a certain point where they were just ubiquitous and people were going to buy their records no matter what, they said, okay, let's get weird. Let's not try to play to like any particular sensibility. Let's just explore ideas and do crazy stuff, right? And so suddenly there's this whole generation of people that are growing up hearing something like Strawberry Fields Forever. I always think like what is that? You know, that's such a wild song, and there's so much going on in there that's like so beautiful, and like I can only imagine like growing up and hearing that for the first time after like your general experience of popular music is, you know, what had come before, and you hear something like that, and just that's got to expand your mind in such a huge way about the possibilities of music. And that's like the thing that I think is the real Beatles legacy. It's that when they were at the height of their mass popularity, they used that to do really, really challenging artistic things to expose that to a wide audience. And I really think like that's such a huge part of the just the general development of music going forward, and especially a lot of the composers that we're talking about. Like, a lot of the reason that they're able to write such interesting music is that they were exposed to such interesting music in the mainstream, which is not something that you can always say. I think that's like I'm not one of those guys. It's like, oh, things used to be so much better back in the day, right. But like I do think that there was a point in the 60s where, like, kind of spurred on by the Beatles, the popular art world was really, really like actually challenging, experimental, and really, really interesting. And after a certain period of time, like what happens with everything, it gets kind of corporatized and then sanded off a little bit. And yeah, it was just like a really beautiful period in history, I feel like, for musical development and turning people on to interesting ideas.
Totally. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I definitely I never totally thought about that, but you're totally right that, like, you know, in so many other situations in decades following, it's like if someone got big, they would just kind of, a lot of the time they would just kind of play into that, as opposed to being like, okay, well, now I've got all this money, now let's try doing something even, you know, like that. You know, I might lose my record label deal next year based off what I'm about to do here, you know. But you're so right. Yeah, the Beatles just, as opposed to when they were like like the biggest thing ever, they suddenly went, yeah, we're done touring and we're just going to screw around in the studio and figure out crap. Like that's nobody does that.
Yeah, and it was just beautiful to me that the audience went along with it, and and that's really kind of their legacy now is that level of turning people on to new things.
Yeah, which is so great.
And putting it in a context that people, that people could understand.
Yeah, exactly.
Because even now, for me, if I just sat down and tried to listen to some Indian classical music, just wouldn't understand what's going on at all.
Yeah, sure.
But finding a way to take that and incorporate it into a Beatles album that's so accessible to
right.
The Western world that's a huge legacy. I never thought of it like that. There's that story of when they recorded Hey Jude and made it 7 minutes long or 8 minutes long or however long it is, and George Martin and the other, I guess, executives, producers were kind of like, you can't put this on the radio, it's too long. They won't play it on the radio. And the Beatles were like, well, if it's us, they will.
Yeah, exactly.
And they couldn't really argue. They're like, well, probably. Yeah. And they did it. And then I can't remember which member of Yes it was, but I was watching a bunch of interviews with the members of Yes, and they were talking about how Hey Jude specifically was responsible for prog rock being able to be popular.
Sure.
Putting clearing the way to say people will listen to 7 minutes of music, a 7 minute piece.
Yeah, if they'll listen to 7 minutes, maybe they'll listen to 9 or 15 or 30.
Who knows?
Yeah. It's so crazy though, because it's the 70s was the height of singles on the radio that were 8 to 9 minutes long. It was totally. I think starting with the early 80s, they started to kind of chill out on that a little bit, but it's so true. It's 70s following right after that was just 70s was just tons of Stairway to Heaven. It's everybody
exactly right.
loves that song. It's 7 to 8 minutes long.
Right,
so.
Totally. Yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
And then if you want to talk about bands like that influencing video game music, you can listen to any Uematsu boss theme, and it's just oh, that's prog rock.
Yeah, exactly.
It's 70s
for
prog
sure.
rock for note for note.
Yeah. It's always interesting to me thinking about Uematsu's influence, where he was basically doing progressive rock with orchestral instruments, but on video game, like the Super Nintendo. So it's very lo-fi orchestral instruments, but it is still orchestral instruments. So it was kind of like a genre fusion in a way. Before that was really happening in the same kind of way. I'm sure now there's tons of stuff like that, but I think it's a unique sound even today, listening back to some of those like early Final Fantasy soundtracks.
Oh yeah.
I know Koji Kondo specifically said in an interview, I can't remember where, but he was talking about when the Super Nintendo came out and he was able to like sample real instruments that were identifiably a real instrument, even if it was pretty lo-fi. And he was thinking like, what do I do with this technology? And his first thought was like, well, I'm going to put a bunch of instruments together in an ensemble that would never be together in an ensemble. Because you can have, on the Super Nintendo, a tuba and steel drums and, banjo playing together. You would never have that in real life. Just, it doesn't make sense acoustically. But, there's those limitations aren't there. So it's interesting to me that his instinct was, okay, how do I make something completely new? How do I like totally break apart the conventions of music with this technology? That says a lot about his personality, I think. Totally. That's how you get like these weirdo sounds on the Super Nintendo. Mario games and Final Fantasy games, you have all these weird genre fusions and instrumentations that
well, it's interesting you say that, because I feel like that is possibly like a key difference between like Kondo and Uematsu, where I feel like I listen to Uematsu's work and I'm like, anytime I hear it orchestrally, like actually transcribed, it's like, oh, now I hear what he heard in his head, you know? Whereas like Kondo's stuff, it's like a lot of it is translated great to orchestra, but like I feel like a lot of Kondo's work is like it total, like he made it its own within its within the game system that it was working with or whatever, the limitations,
totally,
That's a good point. I didn't know that he I never heard that from him, but that makes a lot of sense.
It totally does. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that.
For people that are not really familiar with the band, especially like young people that are like coming up nowadays, where I feel like one of the big common languages among young people musically is video game music. And I think there's so much you can glean from something like the Beatles and apply that to something like video game music. So for younger people especially that maybe don't know that much about the Beatles, what do you think it is about them that makes it so valuable? Which is sort of like what we've been talking about, but just like if you could sum it up a little bit.
Songwriting. I that seems like such a stupid, simple answer. But I think the best written songs are the ones that are going to outlast everything else. Like my favorite movie of all time is Toy Story. And I love that movie because you can hear, you can see the passion that they put into creating that film. And, like they've even said this, but it's incredibly true. It was like, it wasn't about it being the first fully computer animated film that made it last so long and really made an impact on people. It's the fact that it was a great story with great characters that just happened to be the first film that was fully computer animated. And I feel like it's sort of the same thing with the Beatles. They were a band full of firsts, and if not that, just absolutely some of the most influential people for just music and music culture following. But even all of that said, if all they were was just technical firsts, I don't know if they would have been that important, but it's the fact that they were such incredible songwriters that it changes everything. They just, that's why everybody cites them. They're probably one of the top picks that anybody will say. If you ask anybody who are your favorite writers, usually you're going to hear either John Williams or the Beatles. It's just because it's great writing.
Yeah, I think now you stole everything I was gonna say.
We've come full circle.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of parallels between the Beatles and Mozart musically, because they're both musical acts that didn't seem to take themselves very seriously and wrote very accessible music that was also revolutionary in its own way.
Yeah.
And in spite of the sense of humor that we talked about a little bit that they have about their own writing and how, they're not, I'm sure they'd be the first to say, like, we're just writing stupid songs. Like, we don't care. Yeah. Like, the music is so sophisticated and the level of craftsmanship, like, in these little 3-minute pop songs is mind-boggling. And I was thinking about, in preparation, trying to think of like what are some connections between the Beatles and video game music. And the one thing that I thought of, that I thought was one thing that's kind of hard to explain, but it's so important, is like setting expectations musically and using the expectations of the listener to create an interesting musical experience is something that the Beatles were extraordinary at. Like every note. And then what came to mind as a video game example of that is the main Zelda theme, like the original. It's like every note is either setting up some expectation or completely going against your expectation that was set up. And a lot of that, even though stylistically it's so different from any Beatles song, I really feel a Beatles vibe in that writing, that approach to writing. So just like, I think it's easy if you're young now, you do kind of have to like get used to the style of older music to appreciate it. Like you can't just turn on Mozart for a little kid and expect them to be like, oh, this is sick.
Of course, right,
But I think it would behoove anybody who's into music to like, immerse themselves in older music to the point that they can appreciate what the Beatles were doing and then be able to dive in. And because it's going to make, if you're trying to write music, just, there's an entire more knowledge in the Beatles music than you could ever steal. So steal away.
Oh, for sure.
Like,
Like I always say that like video game music like people say like they're fans of video game music, right? And really, to me, that just says I like music because every genre is covered by video game music. You know, like
yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
So like people may not realize it, but like and you've made videos about this where it's like Mario music borrows so much from jazz, right? And like if you like Jump Up Superstar a lot, you might like Duke Ellington or something, you know, right?
Totally, yeah.
But that's one of the things that like I think is so valuable about video game music is that it can bridge gaps between the music that you're hearing in games, just you know, as a course of playing them, and a wider world of music history that you know just broadens your kind of understanding of music and your appreciation for it. So for me, like I think, especially when we're talking about some of those like seminal like game composers like Uematsu and Koji Kondo and everything, like if you like their work, I guarantee there's going to be stuff that you'll find in the Beatles catalog that really vibes with you. And you know, from there, there's just a whole wide network of influences to explore and continue kind of your musical development. There's nothing better than starting to do that and recognizing like, you know, everybody is really, at the end of the day, like we're all kind of working with the same stuff. We're all kind of working with the same tools. We're all you know, yeah. So that to me is like the big thing.
Yeah.
Totally.
But we all come at it differently with our tools, and that's what's so cool about it. That's the beautiful thing. You know?
For sure.
I think that's something really interesting. Is I think there's so many people like you were even saying like how like since there's so many different kinds of video game music and people are like, oh yeah, I like you know, like you were saying, like for instance like the Mario Odyssey theme or something. It's like well, you might be into, you know, say Duke Ellington or just, you know, something big band or whatnot. But what's really interesting to me is like I've talked to so many people that are really into like video game music like that, and it's like they don't know, or they're really getting into composing themselves, and they don't know where those influences are coming from, you know. And so it's like, you know, there's nothing wrong with if you are influenced by, you know, something from Final Fantasy or the Halo theme or something. That's brilliant work. But like there's so much like, again, like I was saying, like looking into their influences and then notice like actually there's so much stuff out there. There's so much great music that's not, you know, video game music that you can take so much from and apply to composing. You know, I think it just it widens or it gives your musical palette a lot more flavor, I think, you know,
for sure,
by having all those different influences outside of video game music. And so, you know, and I'm sure some of that for me, from my background is you know, because I grew up in a musical family, and so I literally was just my dad was pretty much trying to get all different kinds of music into my skull from a early age. In fact, he thought for a long time, he was like, video game music, what, it's not just bleeps and bloops, that's a joke, like, you know. Yeah, no, I think if there's one thing I notice, and I hope that a lot of like newer musicians and composers, people wanting to get into it, realize it's like there's so much out there, and there's so much that these video games are taking from, and like, you know, go listen to that stuff because it's so great. And you know, the Beatles is a really good starting point. So
you really can't go wrong, you know.
You really cannot. You really can't.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you mentioned the Halo theme too, because I know Marty O'Donnell has said that's inspired by Yesterday in a weird way. Yeah, I don't know.
Man, Martin O'Donnell.
I don't know if you ever heard that. That was he was like just talking about like, so what, you know, how do you write like a really memorable melody? And he's just like singing the Yesterday melody and kind of talking about the structure of it and like the arcs and like the contour, like, you know, it's one low point, like one, and everything, and it's like, that's how I wrote the monk thing in the monk chant. It's like just kind of like,
oh my gosh,
it's everywhere, man.
I know that. It is everywhere, man. That's crazy.
Yeah,
that's crazy. That doesn't shock me with Martin though. I know a Beatles fan when I see him. But
yeah, you can smell it.
It's in their eyes, man. You can tell. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It's like you can read when someone's lying through their eyes. I can see when someone's a Beatles fan through their eyes.
For sure.